Hello, dear friends. I'm so glad to welcome you back to another episode of True Catholic Spiritual Stories on Fogman Stories. It's your familiar storyteller here, and today I'll be taking you into a place that might seem ordinary at first glance, but holds a quiet, mysterious presence that has stirred hearts for years. Something science can't explain, something that made an entire school pause and wonder if maybe, just maybe, it was a whisper from heaven. Today's story takes us to a small Catholic high school in rural Pennsylvania, where a modest chapel sits quietly between the school library and the sports field. Inside that chapel hangs a portrait of the Virgin Mary, framed in glass, resting peacefully above the altar. But every year, during the season of Lent, a strange handprint appears on the glass. Faint, almost like a smudge, right in the center, and no matter how many times it's cleaned, no matter how carefully they scrub or even replace the glass, the handprint always returns. Silently, faithfully, as if waiting. At first, people thought it was just a coincidence, a prank. But then, something deeper began to happen. That handprint didn't just appear on the glass. It started to appear in people's hearts. A quiet nun, burdened by an old secret. A parish priest, wrestling with doubts. And a teenage boy named Anthony, whose heart had gone numb since the day he lost his father. One by one, they would come face to face with that silent imprint and find themselves changed. Was it just condensation and light, or was it a gentle touch from heaven, inviting them to come home? This isn't a ghost story filled with screams or shadows. It's a spiritual mystery, one that unfolds slowly, gently, through silence, presence, and grace. So, what are we waiting for? Let's step into chapter 1 of today's story, The First Smudge. Chapter 1, The First Smudge. They say that Lent is a time for silence, for stillness, reflection, and the quiet tug of grace beneath all the noise of the world. But no one ever tells you how deeply silence can echo, especially in a chapel, especially when something reaches through it. My name is Sister Catherine, and I've been the caretaker of St. Dorothea's Chapel for nearly 30 years. Ours is a small Catholic high school nestled in the rolling hills of rural Pennsylvania. The kind of place where time moves slowly and the trees hold secrets older than the buildings themselves. The chapel sits between the library and the gymnasium, quietly tucked away as though heaven itself were hiding behind a brick wall and a pair of wooden doors. It's not grand or ornate. The walls are plain, the pews creak, and the altar cloths are hand-stitched from generations ago. But it's holy ground, consecrated not only by ritual, but by the quiet prayers whispered over the years by students, teachers, janitors, and people who never quite belonged anywhere else. And it has always been my joy to care for it. Every morning, long before the first bell rang, I would come in, unlock the side door, and light the sanctuary lamp. I'd check the candles, sweep the floors, and wipe the glass over the portrait of Our Lady, the old one that hung behind the altar. That portrait had been there since the school opened in the early 1900s. It was beautiful in its simplicity. Mary, cloaked in blue, hands folded in prayer, her eyes looking just slightly downward, gentle, watchful, a mother, And each morning during Lent, I took extra care. The air always felt a little thinner in those weeks, as though something unseen walked alongside us. That year, Ash Wednesday fell on a gray and windless morning. Snow had melted just enough to turn the edges of the path into slush. I remember walking across the courtyard, holding my habit close to keep out the cold, and unlocking the chapel door with fingers numb from age and weather. Inside, the chapel was still, cold, smelling faintly of incense and wood polish. I walked up the central aisle slowly, listening to the echo of my steps. The sanctuary lamp flickered gently, a red ember in the quiet gloom. As always, I made my way to the portrait of the Blessed Virgin. I knelt before her, whispered a prayer I had whispered 1,000 times before. Mother Mary, watch over these children, help them carry what they cannot speak. Teach them silence that heals. Then I rose and reached for my cleaning cloth, the soft white linen I kept folded neatly in the drawer beside the votive candles. I dipped it in warm water and moved toward the glass. A daily ritual, one I never questioned. But that morning, something stopped me. There, right in the center of the glass, was a faint mark, 5 long shapes, a palm, fingers, a handprint. It was subtle, barely visible unless you caught it in the right angle of light. I leaned in, heart suddenly slower, breath catching in my chest. It wasn't oily, like a fingerprint, and it wasn't dusty. It looked pressed, as if someone had leaned in from the other side. I stood there for a long moment, unsure of what to think. My first thought, ridiculous, perhaps, was that one of the students had come in and touched the glass. But I always locked the door after cleaning. No one had access that early. Still, I tried not to let my mind wander. I dipped the cloth again and gently wiped the glass. The smudge vanished immediately. I stepped back, waited. Nothing. A sigh escaped me, half relief, half disappointment. I told myself I was just tired, or perhaps I'd missed it the day before. I went about the rest of my tasks, sweeping the floor, trimming candle wicks, setting out the Lenten missalette. But that image, that faint imprint, stayed with me all day. It wasn't until evening that I returned. The students had long gone home, and the sky outside was dimming into that soft blue shadow that comes before night fully falls. I stepped inside the chapel again, drawn by something I couldn't quite name. Not fear, not curiosity, more like a pull. I didn't turn on the lights, just let the last rays of daylight stretch through the tall windows, casting long shadows over the pews. And there it was, the handprint, back in the exact same place. I walked forward slowly. My heart, this time, didn't just slow, it sank. There was no sound but the wooden groan of the floor under my steps and the faint whistle of wind outside. The mark was identical, the same shape, the same size, not smudged, not random, intentional. I touched the glass lightly, on the opposite side of the print. It felt cold, smooth, perfectly clean under my fingers. I looked behind the frame, ran my hands along the edges. There was no moisture, no grime, no fingerprints elsewhere, only that single, silent palm. I sat in the front pew, didn't say a word, just looked at her. The Virgin's face was unchanged, of course. Calm, still, but I could not shake the feeling that something had been trying to reach her. Or perhaps, through her, reach us. I stayed there a long time, and when I left that evening, I didn't clean the glass. I left the handprint as it was. That night, I didn't tell anyone, not the principal, not Father Thomas, not the other sisters. What would I say? That Mary's portrait has a ghost? No, that would only invite rumors, laughter, suspicion. Instead, I prayed. I lit a candle at my bedside and opened my rosary. I prayed not for answers, but for peace, not for proof, but for clarity. And somewhere between the first and fifth decade, I felt a calm settle over me, not an explanation, but something better, presence. Whatever this was, it wasn't evil. It didn't feel dark. It felt watchful, and for some reason, it felt familiar. The next morning, I returned with fresh water, a clean cloth, and trembling hands. The print was gone. For a full week after that, nothing appeared. I watched carefully, inspecting the glass each morning and evening, but it remained spotless. I began to think it was over, that perhaps it was some strange condensation after all, or even a trick of light. Until the second week of Lent, a Thursday, I entered the chapel and knew, before I even saw it, that it had returned. The print was back, unchanged, waiting, and this time, I whispered aloud, "What do you want from me?" The silence gave no answer, but deep within, I felt something stir. It was only the beginning. Chapter 2. Whispers in the Halls. They say that silence travels faster than sound in places meant for prayer. At St. Dorothea's, it didn't take long for that silence to be broken. I didn't mean for anyone to find out. Truly, I hadn't spoken a word about the handprint, not even in confession. It remained my quiet burden, my silent observation, but still, as it often happens in places where minds are young and hearts are unguarded, word began to spread. First, it was the altar servers. They were good boys, curious, bright-eyed, and always eager to please. But they noticed things, and on the second Monday of Lent, one of them whispered to another while preparing candles. "Did you see it?" The reply came, hushed and hesitant, the hand on the glass. They thought I couldn't hear them. I didn't interrupt. By that afternoon, the whispers had made their way down the halls, past the sophomore lockers, through the cafeteria tables, and even to the back pews where the more rebellious students pretended to pray during quiet study periods. They began calling it the ghost hand. Most took it as a joke, a harmless mystery to spice up the monotony of early spring. But others, especially those who'd lingered in the chapel when no one else was around, began to wonder. I overheard a group of juniors talking by the vending machines. One girl said she saw a faint glow near the Virgin's portrait during morning mass. Another claimed the chapel air felt warmer when she knelt to pray. A boy muttered that he saw something move behind the glass, but quickly laughed it off. It wasn't long before the teachers started to notice the change in atmosphere. Students became more distracted, some strangely attentive during religion class, others more dismissive than ever. Faith, for teenagers, is a fragile and flickering flame, either fanned or snuffed by the slightest breath. That was when Anthony appeared on my radar. Anthony was in the 11th grade, a quiet boy, tall for his age, with a mop of dark hair he rarely bothered to comb. He wasn't the sort to volunteer, or speak out, or even show up on time. His grades hovered just above passing, and his presence was often marked more by absence than participation. But it wasn't laziness, it was grief. I knew the story, everyone did. Anthony had lost his father in a car accident 2 years earlier, a man well loved in the community. A firefighter who died saving a family from a burning home. The loss broke something in the boy. Since then, Anthony had drifted. He still came to school, still showed up in uniform, still nodded politely when addressed. But his eyes never met yours for more than a second, as if he feared what you might see. He wasn't unkind, just quiet, unreachable, like someone standing on the far side of glass. The first time I really noticed him was the day he got detention. He'd been caught sneaking behind the science wing during morning prayer, smoking. They said, or maybe just hiding from it all, the principal didn't suspend him. Instead, she sent him to me. Have him help you in the chapel. She said, let him scrub wax or dust pews. Maybe it'll do him some good. That afternoon, Anthony arrived at the chapel door, eyes cast downward, hands stuffed in his blazer pockets. You're here to help, then? I asked gently. He shrugged. That's what they said. I handed him a cloth. Then let's start with the glass. I watched him approach the portrait with sluggish steps. He didn't look up at Mary's face. He didn't even pause. He just dipped the cloth in water and reached for the glass. Then he froze. His hand, midair, stopped inches before touching the surface. He stared, and I saw it happen. The change. His shoulders tensed, his breath caught. He blinked slowly, as if trying to convince himself that what he saw wasn't real. What is that? He asked, voice lower than a whisper. I stepped forward. The handprint was faint, but visible, right in the center. Just as before, it's been showing up lately, I said softly. He turned to me, expression unreadable. Is it a prank? I don't think so. He turned back to the glass. For a moment, he lifted his own hand, as if to measure it against the print, but stopped halfway. I don't believe in ghosts. He muttered. Neither do I said. But I believe in signs. He didn't reply, just stared. After a while, he cleaned the glass in silence. The mark disappeared again, like it always did, but Anthony lingered. He wiped the same spot 3 times. 4, as if trying to erase something more than just a stain. That night, I stayed late in the chapel. I found myself praying not for answers, but for Anthony. I didn't know why, only that something in his eyes, the way they finally met mine, just for a second, told me the handprint wasn't meant only for me. Something had begun, a stirring, a crack in the wall he'd built around his soul, and I wasn't the only one who noticed. The whispers grew louder in the days that followed. Students claimed the lights flickered when they knelt before the Virgin. One girl fainted during adoration and swore she saw someone standing behind the altar, a woman in blue. A freshman boy ran out of the chapel in tears after seeing the handprint reappear before his eyes. The administration tried to keep it quiet. They feared scandal, or worse, mockery from the diocese. But there are some things that can be buried under announcements and newsletters. The halls buzzed with talk. Teachers prayed more openly. Some parents started coming to Mass again. And Anthony, he came back, not because he had to, but because something was drawing him there. He never said a word, but I saw him, every day after school, sitting alone in the back pew. Watching, waiting. I don't think he knew what he was waiting for, but I think, deep down, he wanted to be seen, to be touched, not by me, not by any of us, but by the one behind the glass. Chapter 3. Lent returns. A year passed. You wouldn't think that something as simple as a smudge could stay with you that long, but it did. It lived quietly in the corners of my mind, resurfacing in quiet moments, during prayers, during sleep. Sometimes I'd close my eyes at night and see it, 5 faint fingers, reaching toward the Virgin. But as spring became summer, and summer turned to fall, the chapel returned to its usual rhythm. The pews creaked with students shifting in place during morning Mass. The candles burned low and steady. The glass remained clean. I still checked every morning. I couldn't help it. Every time I stood before the portrait, I half expected to see that hand again. But it never came. By December, even I had started to believe it was over. Then Lent returned. Ash Wednesday fell on a gray morning again. Just like the year before, there was something about that sky, low, heavy, hushed, that stirred a restlessness in me. Not dread, not quite anticipation either, just a knowing. I arrived early, as I always did. The corridors were silent. The halls had that particular chill they always carried in February, the kind that seemed to seep through stone and plaster. I stepped into the chapel and paused just inside the door. The air felt different. There was no scent of incense, no breeze, but it felt as if someone had been there just moments before me, like the warmth of a breath still hung in the room. I walked slowly to the altar, heart thudding softly in my chest. The sanctuary lamp flickered low. The silence was absolute, and then I saw it. The handprint, same shape, same size, same spot. My knees nearly buckled. I gripped the back of the pew in front of me. Suddenly lightheaded. It had been a year, an entire year of waiting, watching, wondering, and now, as though time itself had looped, it was back, as if it had never left at all. I approached the glass. It looked exactly as it had before, pressed from the inside. Somehow, perfectly formed, not oily, not dusty, just there. I didn't wipe it this time. Not right away. Instead, I knelt, and for the first time since I was a novice, I felt small in the presence of something I could not name. By midday, the rumors had returned too. The students were quicker to believe this time. They didn't need convincing. The handprint had become a kind of legend, whispered through locker doors and across lunch tables, woven into the culture of the school. But this time, the adults began to take it seriously as well. That afternoon, Father Thomas asked to meet me in the chapel. He was a thoughtful man, quiet by nature, younger than most would expect for a school chaplain, just past 50. With kind eyes and a voice that never rose above what was necessary. He'd been with us for little over 10 years, and though he rarely drew attention to himself, I had always known him to be deeply perceptive. "I've heard," he said softly, standing beside me in front of the portrait. "It's back." I nodded, just like last year, first thing in the morning. No one had been here yet. I made sure. He stepped closer to the glass and studied it in silence. Then he touched it gently, as though he expected something to pull back. "What do you make of it, sister?" he asked. I hesitated. "I think it's not meant to frighten us." "No," he agreed. "It doesn't feel that way." After a pause, he added, "I'll have maintenance come in. Let's make sure it's not something simple first. A defect in the glass, a chemical issue, something we missed last year." I nodded again, though in my heart, I already knew it wouldn't work. Over the next 2 weeks, we tried everything. The facility's staff removed the frame and replaced the glass entirely. They brought in a new portrait, freshly printed, sealed in double layers of acrylic. They wiped it with alcohol, with vinegar, with every solution available. Every time the glass was cleaned, the handprint vanished, but the next morning it returned. Same shape, same position, same faint pressure against the Virgin's face. And always during Lent, it never appeared before Ash Wednesday. It never stayed past Easter Sunday. It was punctual, deliberate. Father Thomas grew more quiet with each passing day. He sat in the chapel longer than usual, often after the students had gone home. I would sometimes find him in the front pew, hands clasped, staring at the glass, not with fear, but with something deeper, a kind of searching. One night, he came to the convent. We rarely received visitors after hours, so when I saw his silhouette through the frosted glass of the front door, I knew it was important. He stepped inside, hat in hand, eyes tired. "I've been thinking," he said, without preamble, about the hand. I invited him to sit, poured him tea, and waited. "I've ruled out the natural causes," he said. I spoke with a chemist friend of mine, sent him photographs. He said it doesn't match any known patterns of condensation or reaction. It's not something that can be replicated with cleaning products. He paused. "Sister Catherine, do you believe it's a sign?" I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I asked, "What do you think it's trying to say?" He looked at me then, and in his eyes, I saw something I rarely saw in a priest. A hint of fear, not fear of evil, he said quietly, as if reading my thoughts, but fear of how far we've gone, without noticing who's been calling us back. That Sunday, he gave a homily unlike any I'd heard him deliver before. He spoke of silence, of waiting, of how sometimes heaven doesn't shout, it knocks. Too often, we expect miracles to come loud and flashing. He said, we think they'll break through the clouds and leave no doubt. But what if the real miracle is more patient than that? What if it waits, quietly, behind glass? The students listened, so did the teachers. Even the maintenance crew was there. And after Mass, people didn't leave right away. They lingered, as if they too felt the air shift. By the third week of Lent, the handprint had become something else. Not just a mystery, not just a legend, it had become an invitation. People came in on their lunch breaks to sit in the chapel. Students who hadn't prayed in years knelt awkwardly, silently. Teachers lit candles without saying why. And still, the handprint remained, never changed, never faded, always waiting. One night, as I sat alone in the back of the chapel, I felt something I had no words for. A presence, not a ghost, not a chill, but a nearness. It wasn't Mary's portrait I felt watching me. It was something through her, behind her, as if that gentle mother was holding open a veil, letting someone or something reach us. I closed my eyes, and in the dark, I heard a single question echo through my soul. Will you come back to me? Chapter 4. The Night Watch. There is a silence that only exists at night, not the quiet of an empty hallway or a chapel before morning mass, but a deeper kind, a silence that sinks into the bones, that wraps around your soul like a veil and invites you to listen for something beyond yourself. It was that kind of silence we stepped into on the third Friday of Lent, when Father Thomas decided to hold an all-night vigil. The idea came to him. He said, in prayer, I think we need to make space. He told me one morning as we lit the altar candles, not just room in our schedules, but real spiritual space, a kind of invitation. To what? I asked, though I already knew. To him, he replied simply, and to whatever he's trying to tell us. The invitation went out quietly, not a school-wide announcement, not a bulletin notice, just a few handwritten notes passed to students Father Thomas trusted, a brief mention after religion class, a soft whisper among the teachers. We didn't expect many to come, but they came. That Friday evening, as dusk fell and the chapel filled with the soft gold of candlelight, I watched with quiet awe as more than 20 students filed in through the side door, some in uniform, others in sweatshirts and jeans, their expressions uncertain but sincere. Anthony was among them. He sat in the very back, hood pulled halfway over his head, hands shoved into his pockets. But he was there, and somehow, that was enough. We began with the rosary. Each decade was led by someone different, a teacher, a sister, a student. Between the prayers, we kept silence, not an awkward silence, but a holy one, the kind that feels pregnant with something unseen. Then came quiet adoration. Father Thomas exposed the Blessed Sacrament. The glow of the monstrance shimmered under the candles, and I felt that familiar stillness return, the one I'd only ever felt during Eucharistic nights like this, when the veil between here and heaven feels thinner than paper. People knelt, others sat, some wept. It was well past midnight when it happened. A student, a freshman girl named Eliza, had been sitting near the front, eyes fixed on the portrait of the Virgin Mary. She hadn't said a word all night, hadn't even shifted in her seat. But suddenly, I saw her go rigid. Her back straightened, her hands gripped the pew, and then, without warning, she collapsed. Gasps filled the chapel. I rushed forward, as did Father Thomas and a few others. Her body was trembling, not violently, but with a kind of electric tension. Her eyes were open wide, as if staring at something no one else could see. When Father Thomas leaned in, she grabbed his sleeve and whispered. Through chattering teeth, it touched the glass. What did? He asked softly. The light, she whispered. A hand of light. It pressed the glass. I saw it. It reached out. Then she began to cry. Not from pain or panic, but from something deeper. A trembling, wordless grief. the kind that lives buried in the soul. We helped her to the back of the chapel. One of the teachers, a kind woman named Miss Doyle, stayed with her. Eliza kept repeating the same phrase in a breathless whisper. "It touched the glass. It touched the glass." The rest of the students were stunned. A few shifted nervously. One asked if they should go home. But Father Thomas stood in the center of the aisle, hands gently raised. "She's all right," he said, "but something very real happened here tonight." He let the silence return, then added, more softly, "Sometimes grace shows itself in strange ways." No one left. If anything, they grew stiller. The air was heavy with a kind of awe that had no words. Anthony, I noticed, hadn't moved. He was staring at the portrait of Mary with an intensity I'd never seen in him before, shoulders tight, jaw clenched, like he was trying to hold something in, or trying not to fall apart. We ended the vigil around 3 a.m., the hour of mercy. Candles were snuffed. Students filed out quietly, one by one, wrapped in coats and blankets, stepping into the cold with wide eyes and hushed voices. Eliza had calmed. She left with Miss Doyle and a whispered thank you. Anthony lingered. He didn't speak to anyone, just stood in the back corner, near the old wooden confessional, hands jammed into his hoodie, eyes locked on the portrait of the Virgin. Then he left too, or so I thought. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in my narrow bed at the convent, rosary clutched in my hand, replaying the scene again and again. The way Eliza fell, the look on her face, her voice, barely audible, but full of certainty, a hand of light. Was it metaphor, a vision, a grace? I didn't know, but I believed her. Something had come close. I was still wide awake when, around 4:15, I heard the side door of the chapel creak open. My room is close enough to the chapel entrance that I can hear when someone enters at night. I slipped out of bed, wrapped my shawl around my shoulders, and stepped into the hall. There was no sound, just the faintest echo of a footstep on old tile. I followed it, and there, bathed in the faint amber glow of the sanctuary lamp, stood Anthony. He didn't know I was there. I stayed in the shadows of the entrance, watching. He had removed his hood. His hands were shaking, and he was staring at her, at the Virgin Mary. He walked slowly up the center aisle. His steps were unsteady, like someone approaching a grave or a revelation. He stopped right in front of the glass. I thought he might kneel. He didn't. Instead, he reached out, not to touch the handprint, but to rest his fingers lightly on the wood beneath it. His head dropped, his shoulders rose and fell, and then he cried. No sound, no sobs, just tears, tears that fell like water breaking through a dam. He stood there a long time, weeping quietly in the empty chapel, before finally turning and walking back out into the night. I didn't stop him, didn't speak, didn't tell anyone the next day, because what happened in that chapel wasn't for others to explain. It was between him and her, and whatever grace had chosen to press itself against that glass. Chapter 5. Hidden Sins. It's strange what silence can stir up. Not the kind of silence that fills an empty room, but the kind that presses in after something sacred passes through. The kind that follows an encounter, subtle but unforgettable, After the night watch, the silence didn't leave us. It deepened. People walked differently through the halls of St. Dorothea's. They lowered their voices. They looked each other in the eye a little longer. They lingered in the chapel longer. 2. Teachers and students alike. And for the first time in years, the confessional was never empty. It began quietly. A single teacher, Mr. Lowell, who taught ethics and Latin, slipped into the chapel one afternoon and sat in the far back pew for almost an hour. I passed him on my way to refill the holy water fonts. His face looked pale, not sick, not tired, just unguarded. The next morning, I saw him again, this time kneeling. His hands trembled slightly as he crossed himself, and afterward, he spoke to Father Thomas for nearly half an hour in the sacristy. When he left, his eyes were red. I said nothing, but I watched. That day in class, his voice cracked while reading from the Book of Wisdom. The students noticed, and somehow, none of them laughed. The next was Mrs. Fernandez. She was known for being composed, almost to the point of coldness. She taught literature and insisted on strict silence during writing exercises. Students said her classroom felt like a library and that she never smiled. But one morning, she asked to speak to me privately. We sat on a bench outside the convent garden. The daffodils were just starting to rise through the soil, trembling in the breeze. She didn't speak for several minutes. Then finally, she whispered, "Do you believe the handprint is real?" I answered without hesitation, "Yes." She nodded slowly. "I think it sees something in us." She looked down at her hands. They were tightly clasped, as if holding back a tide. When I was younger, I nearly walked away from my family. I was going to leave my husband and my son. I had written the letter, packed the bag. I even drove halfway to the airport. But something stopped me. She looked up at me, her eyes glassy. I've never told anyone that, not even in confession. But lately, every time I see that hand, I feel like it knows, like it's waiting for me to stop pretending. I took her hand in mine, and I said only this, "Then maybe it's not just waiting, maybe it's inviting." She was the first to return to the confessional, and the first to come out smiling. Not the kind of smile that tells the world everything is perfect, but the kind that says something broken has begun to heal. Within days, others followed, one by one. Teachers and staff began to seek out Father Thomas, not with noise, not with drama, but with a quiet gravity that told me something was shifting beneath the surface of our school. A math teacher confessed he'd been gambling in secret. The janitor admitted he'd been stealing cleaning supplies to sell. Another teacher, a young woman named Ruth, broke down in tears during a staff meeting, confessing she'd been considering suicide just weeks before Lent began. She said the handprint stopped her. She'd walked into the chapel one afternoon, completely numb, looking for a place to be alone. And there it was, pressed faintly against the glass, not glowing, not moving, but there. She said it felt like it was placed there for her, like someone, somewhere, wanted her to stay. I had never seen anything like it. These were not dramatic conversions or tearful revivals. They were quieter than that, but no less miraculous. And every time someone came forward, every time someone opened the door to the confessional, something in the chapel seemed to grow brighter. Not literally, not physically, But spiritually, the space felt warmer, lighter, as if the shadows were being pulled back, piece by piece. But still, I had not gone. I had not confessed the one thing that had haunted me for over 50 years. It wasn't that I hadn't wanted to. It was that I didn't think I deserved to. Before I became Sister Catherine, I was just Catherine Morrow, a college student, an only child, bright, lonely, afraid, and one cold autumn, when I was just 19, I made a decision that would alter the entire course of my life. I ended a pregnancy. No one knew, not even the father. It was a choice made in fear, in isolation, in shame, a choice that haunted me long after the physical pain had faded. I had thought of confessing many times. I even approached the confessional once in my 20s, heart racing, palms damp, but I couldn't open my mouth. By the time I entered the convent, I had buried it deep inside me, convincing myself that if I just lived a life of service, of prayer, of penance, maybe God would understand. Maybe that would be enough. But now, after all these years, after the handprint returned again and again, after watching the students and teachers around me find healing through truth, I knew that I could no longer keep it hidden. I waited until the chapel was empty. It was a Thursday afternoon. Rain fell softly outside, tapping against the stained glass windows in a rhythm that felt almost like breath. I knelt before the Virgin's portrait. The handprint was there, as it always was. I stared at it for a long time. Then I whispered, "You know." I felt the tears before I realized I was crying. "You've always known." And then I did something I had never done before. I walked into the confessional. Father Thomas said nothing as I knelt, just opened the screen, gently. "Bless me, Father, for I have sinned." My voice shook, my throat closed, and then I told him everything. The words came slowly at first, like stones tumbling down a hillside. But once they started, they would not stop. I told him about the clinic, about the silence, about the guilt, about how I had carried it like a second heart, beating beneath my habit for over 50 years. When I finished, I waited, and then came the words that cracked me open. "God has already forgiven you. Sister, now let him show you." I left the confessional trembling, but lighter. I returned to the chapel and knelt again before the glass. The handprint was still there, but for the first time, I didn't feel fear or shame when I saw it. I felt held. That night, Father Thomas gave a short reflection at Vespers. "We often think the hand of God comes to punish," he said, "but perhaps it comes to press against the walls we've built, to say, 'Let me in.'" And in that moment, I knew the truth. The hand on the glass was not a warning. It was a welcome. Chapter 6. The Conversion. I noticed the change before anyone said a word. It wasn't dramatic. There were no hallelujahs, no visions, no loud declarations of faith. Just a boy, quiet, thoughtful, and once so closed off, now walking into the chapel every day. At first, it was always the same. Anthony would enter quietly, nod to me if I happened to be there, and sit in the back pew. He never stayed long, maybe 15 minutes. Long enough to look at the glass, long enough to sit in silence. Then he'd leave, but gradually, he began to stay. First 20 minutes, then 30, Eventually, he was there before school began. Then again at lunch. Then again, just before dark. He never spoke to the other students, never came with friends, but each time, his eyes were different, more open, more searching. Something was happening in him. One day, as I lit the sanctuary lamp, I saw him standing by the portrait of Our Lady. His hand was raised, hovering over the glass, but he didn't touch it. Instead, he turned and looked at me. There was something in his gaze that hadn't been there before. Not fear, not even curiosity. It was hunger. He walked toward me slowly, still unsure of his voice, and asked, almost too quietly to hear, "Do you think God can forgive anything?" I nodded, yes. He frowned, "Even if you didn't ask for a long time?" I nodded again, especially then. He sat down on the front pew and stared at the floor. "I've done things I'm not proud of," he said. "I've said awful things to my mom. I hated everyone after my dad died. I hated God. I didn't even believe he was real." He looked up at me. "But I don't know, something's been chasing me." I sat beside him. "Maybe he's not chasing you." I said, "Maybe he's waiting." He didn't answer, but his hands were shaking. It was later that week, on a rainy Thursday, that Anthony asked to speak with Father Thomas. They sat together in the sacristy for nearly 2 hours. I didn't overhear their conversation, nor would I have wanted to. But when Anthony came out, something in him had shifted. There was light in his eyes, real light, like the frost had finally melted. That afternoon, he stayed in the chapel long after school ended. He didn't sit in the pew. He knelt, head bowed, hands folded, and then, as I passed by to check the candles, I heard him whisper something, too soft to catch. But it wasn't for me. It was a prayer. The moment I will never forget came just a few days later. I had been sweeping the back aisle, letting the rhythm of the broom soothe my thoughts. Anthony was already there, kneeling in front of the portrait. The handprint was faint that day, just barely visible. He didn't seem to notice I was nearby. I watched as he leaned forward, pressing his hand lightly against the wooden frame beneath the glass. He stared at the mark, breath held. Then he did something I didn't expect. He lifted his hand and placed it directly over the print. His fingers matched, exactly. He froze. His whole body went still. And then, with a sharp breath, he drew his hand back. He stumbled slightly, sat back on his heels, and held his palm as if it had burned him. And then, the tears came. But they weren't sad. They were radiant. He looked up at the portrait of Mary and whispered, this time loud enough for me to hear, "I believe." There was no thunder, no blinding light, but I knew, in that instant, that heaven had touched him, and that he had touched it back. He asked to be baptized again. Father Thomas explained that he had already received the sacrament as a child. That baptism was indelible, unrepeatable, but Anthony insisted, not out of theological confusion, but out of a desire to begin again. "I just want to say yes," he said, "with my whole self, on purpose." Father Thomas, with great tenderness, offered a special rite of renewal, a public affirmation of baptismal promises. Anthony accepted, and then, days later, came the second conversation. He found me after school, eyes full of something fierce and trembling. I think I'm supposed to give my life to this." He said. I didn't ask what this meant. I already knew. "I think I'm supposed to become a priest." I smiled. "That would be a miracle." "No," he said, "the miracle already happened. That Easter Sunday, St. Dorothea's was more crowded than I had ever seen it. Parents, students, alumni, even townspeople who hadn't set foot inside the chapel in years, filled the pews. Candles lined the aisles, the scent of lilies hung thick in the air, and the sanctuary seemed to shine brighter than I had ever known. Anthony stood near the altar that morning, dressed in simple white, not as a priest, not yet, but as someone who had begun the journey. During the Mass, Father Thomas gave a homily I will never forget. He stood before the congregation, hands folded, voice calm. "We live in a world that demands signs," he said, "proof, evidence. We want heaven to crash through our walls, to make itself known with power and spectacle." He paused. "But the greatest signs are quiet." He looked toward the portrait of Mary. "Sometimes God leaves fingerprints instead of thunder, not to frighten us, not to confuse us, but to remind us that He is near, and that when we are ready, we will see Him." He turned back to the people. "Anthony came to me weeks ago and asked if he could begin again. But the truth is, he already had, not because someone told him what to believe, but because a hand touched his heart and he had the courage to answer." The room was silent. Then Anthony stepped forward in front of the entire community, renewed his baptismal promises. Tears fell freely, mine among them. Not for sorrow, but for joy. Joy that grace still walks among us. Joy that mercy is real. And joy that sometimes miracles do not need to shout. They only need a hand, pressed gently against the glass. Chapter 7. The Last Lent. They say some places remember. Stone walls soak up prayers. Wooden pews cradle silent tears. And the quiet air inside a chapel can hold on to grace long after the candles have burned out. Years passed. I grew older, slower, and quieter still. My hands trembled more with each season, and the mornings came heavier than before. But the chapel remained unchanged, humble, warm, always waiting, and so did the handprint. It never failed to return. Every Ash Wednesday, I would walk into the chapel with my breath caught in my throat, wondering if this would be the year it stayed gone. It never was. There, faint and unwavering, it would appear once again, right in the center of the glass that framed Our Lady's face. And like every year, it would vanish after Easter Sunday, as if it had only come to walk with us through the desert days of Lent, and no further. Students changed, teachers came and went, some of the old staff retired, new names appeared on class rosters, new laughter echoed through the halls. But somehow, the story remained. They all knew about the hand. They came not to gawk, but to pause, to kneel, to look inward. Eventually, the chapel became something more than just a school sanctuary. It became a place of pilgrimage. Word spread, not through headlines, not through news broadcasts, but through hushed conversations. A parent telling another parent, a former student bringing back a spouse, a seminarian making a quiet detour before ordination. They came in twos and threes, never in crowds, always quietly, as if the place had taught them how to enter with reverence. They would walk to the glass, kneel before the Virgin, and gaze at the handprint as though it held their own name. And then they would sit, or cry, or pray without words, and leave different. Anthony had long since taken his place among the clergy. He was Father Anthony now. He didn't go far. After seminary, he returned to St. Dorothea's as chaplain, quietly, without ceremony, just the way he would have wanted. The students loved him. The faculty trusted him. He never told them his full story unless they asked, but somehow they understood. He was the one who lingered longest in the chapel. He was the one who sat beside the uncertain students. He was the one who, every year, during Lent, would light an extra candle beneath the portrait and stay there deep into the night. He never claimed to hear voices, never spoke of visions, but every now and then, I would see him press his hand gently against the wood beneath the glass and close his eyes. I was 84 when I began to feel the end draw near. There was no illness, no sudden collapse, just a soft, daily knowing, a slow and holy quieting inside my bones. I stopped sweeping the chapel floors. Others could do that now. I no longer lit the candles myself, but I watched them from my seat in the front pew. And every day, I knelt before the handprint. It still appeared without fail. Every Lent, I had come to think of it not as a mystery, but as a rhythm, like the tide or the breath of God, coming close, then pulling back, not to disappear, but to wait. It was the third week of Lent when I felt the time come. I had woken early, before sunrise, and dressed slowly. My joints ached, my eyes had dimmed, but my soul was still bright, still burning. I made my way to the chapel alone. The school was asleep. The sky was still dark. Inside, the chapel glowed with its usual soft amber light. The candles had already been lit, perhaps by Father Anthony, who often arrived early. I walked slowly to the front, and there it was, the handprint, clearer than I had ever seen it before. It almost shimmered. I stood there for a moment, trembling, not with fear, but with awe. Then, with more effort than I expected, I reached out. I didn't place my whole hand against the glass. I let my fingertips touch it, gently, reverently, and then I knelt. My knees barely held, my breath slowed. I prayed, not with words, just presence. And when I finished, I leaned forward one final time and laid my palm flat against the glass. I don't know how long I stayed like that, but when they found me later that morning, still kneeling, my hand resting on the glass, I was no longer breathing. I left this world the way I had hoped to, in the chapel I loved, in the presence of the hand I had once feared, and with peace I could never have imagined 50 years ago. They buried me quietly, no headlines, no pomp, just psalms and silence, and lilies. After the funeral, Father Anthony returned to the chapel. Alone, he knelt where I had knelt, and he wept, not in sorrow, but in gratitude, because something strange had happened. When the sisters had gently moved my body, one of them had noticed something strange. My hand had been resting directly on the glass, and when they compared the size, the shape, the position, they found that the print matched mine perfectly, finger for finger, palm for palm. Even in death, my hand had rested exactly where the mysterious handprint had always appeared. It was as if I had been the one he was waiting for all along. Or perhaps, as I believe we all are, Father Anthony never told anyone what he whispered that night in the chapel after I was gone. But he remained. Every Lent, he would stay awake through the night, watching, not for ghosts, but for grace. He still lights that extra candle. He still hears confessions deep into the evening. And he still places his hand beneath the glass, matching the print as if it were a sacred relic. A reminder of everything unseen and holy. People still come. They still kneel. They still cry. They still hope. And the handprint still returns. Not to frighten, not to confuse, but to call. They ask me about it sometimes. The hand, is it still there? Do you still see it? Do you think it's real? I never answer the way they expect me to. I don't talk about miracles or mysteries. I don't show them old photos. I don't tell them about the night Sister Catherine passed away in front of that glass. Her fingers aligned with something eternal. I simply say, yes, I see it, and if they look closely at me, really closely, they'll see that I'm not talking about the glass. I was only a boy when it started. I was angry, detached, hollowed out by grief I didn't know how to name. My father had died, and I didn't know how to believe in a God who allowed that kind of pain. I went through the motions, Mass, confession, school, rosaries, but none of it touched me. Until that day in the chapel, until I saw the mark on the glass, faint, human, and somehow impossibly holy. That hand didn't push, it didn't demand, it waited, and when I was ready, it didn't reach for my body, it reached for my soul. That's when I began to believe in gentle miracles. Years have passed. I've grown older, grayer, a little more tired around the eyes. But the chapel remains. So does the hand. Each Lent, it returns, without sound, without spectacle, just a faint palm, barely there, like the echo of a prayer that never stopped whispering. People still come. Some drive for hours. Some take trains and buses, walking the last few miles in silence. They don't come to be amazed. They come to remember, or to begin again. I meet them in the pews, or in the confessional, or just in the quiet. They ask me, Father, what do you think it means? I never rush to answer, because meaning doesn't arrive wrapped in certainty. It grows in the stillness between questions. But when I do speak, I say this: it is not a mark of judgment. It is a mark of mercy. I think about Sister Catherine often. She was a living tabernacle of steadiness. Her voice never rose. Her steps were never hurried. But when she entered a room, you knew it. And when she died, there, on her knees, with her hand pressed to that glass, I knew heaven had touched her back. They told me afterward that her hand matched the print exactly. They looked shocked when they said it. I wasn't. There are no coincidences in grace. Some nights, I stay in the chapel well past midnight. The students are asleep. The campus is dark. Only the faint rustle of leaves and the steady breath of wind keeps me company. I sit in the pew beneath the portrait of Our Lady. I watch the shadows. I let the silence do its work. And there it is, always. That faint hand, not glowing, not glowing, not cold, just there, a reminder, not of what I've lost, but of who never left. I used to think the hand was meant to scare us. A ghost, a warning, some supernatural trace we couldn't explain. But I was wrong. It's not a mystery, not anymore. It's a message, soft, patient, unchanging. A hand that says, I see you, I'm here, come back. It doesn't matter who you are. A teacher too tired to hope. A teenager with no father and too many questions. A nun with a secret no one else knew. It doesn't matter. The hand never judged. It never scolded. It never withdrew. It just waited. Now, every Lent, I place my hand against the glass. And for a moment, I feel it. A warmth, not physical, but unmistakable. Like a memory pressing itself into the present. And I say, beneath my breath, I still believe, because I do, not in signs, not in stains, not in strange happenings on holy glass. I believe in the one who placed it there, the one who uses even fingerprints to bring us home. We speak often of fire and thunder when we speak of God. But I think, sometimes, he chooses something gentler, a hand on glass, a tear that won't stop falling, a moment of stillness that makes your soul tremble, not because he wants to frighten you, but because he wants to wake you. I've watched hardened men kneel here and break. I've seen children point to the print and smile like they've been spoken to. I've seen dying women press their fingers to the glass with eyes full of hope. And I've seen myself in all of them. I don't know how long the hand will keep returning. Maybe one day it will stop. Maybe that, too, will be part of the plan. But for now, I keep watch, each Lent, each night, because I know that someone will walk through those doors, not even knowing why they came. And they'll kneel, and they'll look, and they'll feel it, that gentle touch, and it might just be enough. Enough to believe, enough to begin again, just like it was for me. So if you ever find yourself lost, unsure, aching in that place you've kept hidden from everyone else, come here, sit beneath the portrait, look at the glass, and wait, because somewhere, unseen, a hand is already waiting for yours. Not to grab you, not to push you, but simply to reach. And when it touches your soul, you'll know what I know. It was never a mark of mystery. It was always a mark of mercy. I will give you a new heart and put a new spirit in you. Ezekiel chapter 36 verse 26. That's the whole story. What do you think? Was it a miracle, or something even quieter, deeper? As for me, I believe some signs are meant to be felt, not solved, and maybe, just maybe, that handprint was one of them. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe and support Fogman Stories. Thank you for listening, and see you in the next journey of faith and mystery. God bless, and good night.